Welcome to The Secret of the Sapphire Coffin. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey, but before we start, let me know, from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about? Chapter 1, The Man with the Blue Relic. It was on a bitter evening in late November of the year 1895 that the singular affair of the Sapphire Coffin first cast its long shadow across the threshold of our rooms at 221B Baker Street. I recall the date with precision, for I had spent the better part of the afternoon composing a letter to my former colleague at Bart's regarding a most unusual case of tropical anemia, and the ink had scarcely dried upon the paper when the events I am about to relate set themselves irrevocably in motion. Sherlock Holmes had been in one of his darker moods for the better part of a week. He had taken no case since the resolution of the Whitfield forgery, a matter he had dismissed as an insult to the criminal classes, and had retreated into that dangerous state of ennui which I had learned to dread more than any villain's machinations. His violin lay untouched upon the settee. His correspondence remained unopened in a heap beside the Persian slipper where he kept his tobacco. Even the agony columns of the daily papers, which he ordinarily devoured with the appetite of a starving man at a banquet, lay scattered and unread upon the floor. "You might at least open the window," I ventured, glancing at the chemical apparatus that cluttered the deal-top table near the fireplace. Holmes had been conducting some malodorous experiment involving zinc filings and what I strongly suspected was sulphuric acid, and the atmosphere had grown positively oppressive. "Mrs. Hudson will have words if you've ruined another set of curtains." Holmes, who had been reclining in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown with his eyes fixed upon the ceiling, did not deign to look at me. "Mrs. Hudson's curtains are the least of England's concerns this evening, Watson. I have just counted 7 distinct varieties of damp stain upon that ceiling, and I assure you, each one tells a more compelling story than anything the Metropolitan Police have offered me this month." I was formulating a suitably exasperated reply when the sharp clatter of hooves upon the cobblestones below arrested both our attentions. It was not the measured trot of a hansom returning a gentleman from his club, nor the heavy plod of a brewer's dray. This was the desperate, uneven gallop of a horse driven hard through streets never meant for such urgency, the sound of a man in extremis. Holmes was at the window before I had even set down my pen. The transformation was instantaneous and remarkable. The languid figure of moments before had vanished entirely, replaced by the keen, alert predator I knew so well. His grey eyes narrowed as he peered through the fog-smeared glass into the gaslit street below. "A private brougham," he announced, his voice carrying that unmistakable edge of suppressed excitement. "The horses have been changed at least once. Note the mismatched pace of the leaders. The coachman is not the regular man. Observe how he overworks the brake on the descent. And unless I am very much mistaken, our visitor is a man of considerable means, who has travelled from well beyond the city proper in a state of considerable agitation." "How on earth can you tell all that from up here?" I protested, though by now I ought to have known better than to question his observations. "The crest upon the door, Watson. Even through this deplorable fog, I can make out the arms of the Pembroke family, argent, a lion rampant gules, one of the oldest baronetcies in Devonshire. And yet the mud upon the wheels is not Devonshire clay. It is the distinctive chalk and loam mixture one finds only in the Hampshire Downs, which suggests our visitor has taken a most circuitous route to reach us. A man who travels by indirect roads on a night such as this is either running from something or towards something with equal desperation." The front door below opened and closed with force sufficient to rattle the windows. Heavy, uneven footsteps thundered up the 17 stairs. I noted Holmes counting them silently, as was his invariable habit, and before Mrs. Hudson could announce our visitor, the door to our sitting room burst open with such violence that the frame itself groaned in protest. The man who stood upon our threshold was tall and powerfully built, though the hand that gripped the doorframe trembled visibly. He was perhaps 50 years of age, with a patrician face weathered by country life and framed by iron-grey hair that had been recently and carelessly disordered by agitated fingers. His attire spoke of wealth and breeding, a heavy greatcoat of excellent cut, a waistcoat of burgundy silk, gold watch chain, but the overall impression was one of profound disarray. His collar had come unfastened on one side. His left boot bore a deep scratch across the toe cap, as though he had stumbled against stone in the dark. And his eyes, those were the eyes of a man who has gazed upon something that has shaken the very foundations of his world. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, and the words came in the broken cadence of a man who has been holding his breath for far too long. "For God's sake, you must help me. They told me you were the only man in London who could, the only one who might understand." Holmes had already risen and guided the man to the basket chair beside the fire, with a deftness that belied his earlier lethargy. "Pray be seated, Lord Pembroke. Watson, the brandy if you would, and perhaps you might close the door. I fancy our visitor's tale is not one for the landing." The nobleman's eyes widened. "You know me, sir?" "I know your family crest, your Devonshire estate, and the particular shade of Hampshire chalk upon your wheels," Holmes replied, settling into his own chair with the casual authority of a magistrate taking the bench. "I also know that the scratch upon your boot was made by limestone, cemetery limestone, unless I miss my guess, and that the blue dust upon your right cuff is not indigo, nor cobalt, nor any common dye. It is powdered corundum, sapphire dust, Lord Pembroke. Now, I suggest you begin at the beginning, and omit nothing, however trivial it may seem." Lord Alistair Pembroke took a steadying draught of brandy, and with visible effort composed himself. When he spoke, his voice had the clipped precision of a man accustomed to command, though it faltered at intervals as the weight of his tale pressed upon him. "The Pembroke family has held Thornfield Hall in Devonshire for 11 generations, Mr. Holmes. We are not people given to superstition or fancy, but there is one thing, one object, that has haunted my family like a curse for over a century. We call it the Sapphire Coffin." Holmes's eyes gleamed. He steepled his long fingers beneath his chin, that characteristic gesture which I had come to recognize as the outward sign of his most intense concentration, and said nothing. "It is a small box," Pembroke continued, "no larger than a lady's jewellery case, fashioned in the shape of a coffin and encrusted with sapphires of extraordinary size and colour. It was brought to England in 1793 by my ancestor, Colonel Horatio Pembroke, who served with the East India Company during the campaigns against Tipu Sultan. The colonel was, by all accounts, a man of iron nerve and few scruples, the sort of man the Empire bred in those days, and the circumstances under which he acquired the coffin were never spoken of openly. "The family legend," Lord Pembroke said, lowering his voice as though the very walls of Baker Street might carry his words to hostile ears, "holds that the coffin conceals a secret, one so terrible that Colonel Horatio decreed it should never be opened. He had it sealed within the family crypt at St. Dunstan's churchyard, behind a wall of stone, with instructions that it should remain undisturbed until the last Pembroke lay in the earth beside it." "A most theatrical injunction," Holmes observed dryly, "and one which, I take it, has not been honoured." The colour drained from Pembroke's face. 3 nights ago, Mr. Holmes, I received word from the vicar of St. Dunstan's that the crypt had been violated. The wall was broken open. The sapphire coffin was gone." A silence fell upon the room. broken only by the crack and hiss of the fire in the grate. I watched Holmes carefully. His expression had not changed, yet I detected that subtle quickening, a faint dilation of the pupils, a barely perceptible straightening of the spine, that told me his formidable intellect had engaged itself fully. "And there is more," Holmes said. It was not a question. "Lord." Pembroke nodded, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "The caretaker of the churchyard, old Thomas Craddock, who had tended the grounds for 37 years, was found dead at the entrance to the crypt. His neck was broken." I felt a chill pass through me that owed nothing to the November wind. "Good Lord," I murmured. "The local constabulary have concluded that poor Craddock surprised the thieves and was killed for his trouble," Pembroke said bitterly. "They have made their inquiries, questioned the usual vagrants and petty criminals in the district, and have arrived precisely nowhere. Inspector Rawlings, a well-meaning but entirely inadequate man, has all but declared the case unsolvable." "Inspector Rawlings of the Hampshire Constabulary," Holmes said, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, I have had occasion to observe his methods. He once spent 3 weeks searching for a stolen horse that was standing in its own stable, under a borrowed blanket. Watson, you are making notes? Good. Lord Pembroke, I have 3 questions, and I must ask you to answer them with absolute precision." The nobleman straightened in his chair. "Anything, Mr. Holmes? First, apart from yourself and the vicar, who else knew the exact location of the sapphire coffin within the crypt?" Pembroke considered this carefully. "My family solicitor, Mr. Josiah Hartwell of Hartwell and Crane, Lincoln's Inn. He holds the Pembroke estate papers, which include a diagram of the crypt. My cousin, Captain Reginald Pembroke, he and I are the last of the direct line, and—" He hesitated. There was a scholar, a Professor Elias Vane of the British Museum. He wrote to me some months ago requesting permission to examine the coffin for a monograph he was preparing on colonial artefacts. I refused him naturally, but the correspondence was extensive. "Excellent," said Holmes. "Second, has anyone made a formal offer to purchase the coffin?" "Indeed. A collector by the name of Mr. Marcus Havelock approached me not 6 weeks past. He is known in certain circles as a man who acquires rare antiquities by whatever means present themselves. He offered an extraordinary sum, £5,000, for what he described as a minor family heirloom. I turned him away. He did not take the refusal gracefully. Holmes's fingers drummed once upon the arm of his chair. "And third, you mentioned that your ancestor brought the coffin from India in 1793. Have you any notion whatsoever of what the coffin is supposed to contain?" For the first time, something shifted in Lord Pembroke's expression. It was not merely fear. I had seen fear plainly enough since he crossed our threshold. This was something older and deeper, the dread of a man confronting a family shame that has been passed from father to son like a disease of the blood. Colonel Horatio's private journal, which has been kept under lock and key at Thornfield since his death in 1831, contains a single reference to the coffin's contents. He wrote, "What lies within is not treasure but testimony," and its revelation would see the Pembroke name struck from the rolls of honour and cast into the gutter of history. Those were his exact words, Mr. Holmes. I have read them 100 times, and they haunt me still. Holmes rose from his chair with the sudden, decisive energy of a man who has found his quarry. The torpor of the past week had been burned away as completely as morning fog before the sun, and in its place was that fierce, bright-eyed intensity that made Sherlock Holmes the most formidable investigator of his age. "Lord Pembroke, your case presents several features of considerable interest. A sealed crypt violated by someone with precise knowledge of its contents. A caretaker murdered, not by a common thief's blunt instrument, but by a method requiring both strength and a certain anatomical understanding, and an artifact whose value clearly transcends mere gemstones." He paused and fixed the nobleman with a gaze as sharp as a surgeon's blade. "You have been wise to come to me, and you have been wise to come tonight. Watson, clear your appointments for the morning. We leave for Hampshire on the first train." "You will take the case, then?" Pembroke's voice was thick with relief. "I would sooner refuse to breathe," Holmes replied, and I knew from long experience that this was no mere theatrical flourish. The game was afoot, and Sherlock Holmes was, at last, himself again. As I showed Lord Pembroke to the door and watched his brougham disappear into the swirling November fog, I returned to find Holmes standing before the fireplace, his pipe already lit, his eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. "Watson," he said quietly, without turning, "I would ask you to bring your service revolver. There is something about this business that I do not yet see clearly, and when I cannot see, it is generally because someone has taken great pains to ensure that I remain in the dark." "You suspect danger, then?" He turned to face me, and the firelight threw his angular features into sharp relief, casting shadows that made his face appear as a mask carved from pale stone. "I suspect, my dear Watson, that the Sapphire Coffin has been sleeping for 100 years, and that someone has woken it for reasons that will prove far more terrible than a simple theft. A broken neck is not the work of a common burglar. It is the signature of a man who kills with purpose, and without hesitation." He drew deeply upon his pipe and exhaled a thin stream of smoke that curled upward like a grey phantom in the lamplight. "No, Watson, this is not a theft. This is the first move in a game whose rules we do not yet understand, and until we do, every player on the board is in mortal danger, including, I rather suspect, ourselves." The fire crackled and spat. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows of Baker Street like a living thing, and I felt, with the certainty of a man who has walked too many times into the unknown at Sherlock Holmes's side, that we stood upon the edge of something vast and dark and old, something that had waited a very long time to be found. I locked my desk, checked my revolver, and began to pack. Chapter 2: The Legend of the Coffin. We departed Waterloo Station shortly after 7 o'clock the following morning, aboard the Hampshire Express, the grey November dawn offering little comfort as London's sprawling mass gave way to the frost-bitten pastures of the southern counties. Holmes had spoken scarcely a word since we left Baker Street. He sat opposite me in our first-class compartment, with his knees drawn up, his thin fingers pressed together beneath his chin, and his gaze fixed upon the racing landscape with an intensity that suggested he was seeing none of it whatsoever. Lord Pembroke occupied the seat beside the window, and though the brandy and a few hours of fitful sleep at his hotel had restored some colour to his cheeks, the haunted quality had not left his eyes. He carried with him a leather document case, which he clutched against his chest as a drowning man might grip a plank. "Lord Pembroke," Holmes said abruptly, breaking a silence that had endured since Basingstoke, "you mentioned last evening that your ancestor, Colonel Horatio, brought the Sapphire Coffin from India in 1793. I should like to hear everything your family records say about the Colonel and the circumstances of his acquisition. Leave nothing out. The smallest detail of family gossip may prove more instructive than a sworn deposition." Pembroke opened the document case and withdrew a sheaf of yellowed papers handled with the reverence one might afford a holy relic. "These are transcriptions from the Colonel's private journal," he said. "The originals remain at Thornfield under lock and key. My father had these copies made in 1862, and they have been passed to the eldest son of each generation since." Holmes received the papers with the delicate touch of a man accustomed to handling evidence, and I observed him bring the topmost page close to his face, not to read the words, but to examine the paper itself, its weight, its texture, the particular quality of the ink. "The Colonel writes sparingly," Pembroke continued. "He was not a man given to sentiment. but the passages concerning the coffin are unlike anything else in the journal. They are written in a hand that trembles, and Colonel Horatio Pembroke, by every account, was a man whose hand never trembled, not even under cannon fire at Seringapatam. He directed Holmes to a passage near the middle of the sheaf. Holmes read it aloud, his voice flat and precise, stripping the words of all emotion so that their meaning stood bare and terrible in the rattling compartment of the train. "I have taken from the vaults of the Dorai temple that which was not mine to take. The priest called it Nidra Ratna, the sleeping jewel, and swore upon their gods that its opening would bring ruin upon any house that sheltered it. I did not believe them then. I am not certain I disbelieve them now. What lies within is not treasure, but testimony, and its revelation would see the Pembroke name struck from the rolls of honour and cast into the gutter of history. I have therefore sealed the coffin behind stone in the crypt of St. Dunstan's, where neither light nor curiosity may reach it, and I charge my sons and their sons after them. Let it sleep." Holmes lowered the page. His expression betrayed nothing, but I noticed that his right thumb had begun to tap a rapid, irregular rhythm against his knee, a habit I had observed only when his mind was working at its highest velocity. "Nidra Ratna," he murmured, "the sleeping jewel, a poetic name for an object that has now, quite literally, been awakened. Tell me, Lord Pembroke, this temple the Colonel mentions, the Dorai temple, does the name appear elsewhere in his writings?" "Nowhere. I've searched every page. And the phrase testimony, not treasure, but testimony. Your ancestor was a military man, Lord Pembroke. Military men choose their words as carefully as they choose their ground. He did not write secret or confession. He wrote testimony, a word that implies evidence. Evidence of what, I wonder? The train lurched as we passed through a junction, and the papers shifted in Holmes's lap. He caught them with an absent hand, but his gaze had turned inward, and I recognized the look of a man assembling pieces of a puzzle whose edges had not yet revealed themselves. "There is one more thing," Pembroke said quietly. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. When he unfolded the cloth, something caught the pale morning light and threw a chip of cold blue fire across the compartment ceiling. It was a sapphire, or what appeared to be one. Roughly the size of a man's thumbnail, it was cut not in the faceted style of a jeweller's stone, but in a smooth, flat disc, with a precision that spoke of machinery rather than craft. "This was found upon the floor of the crypt," Pembroke said. "It must have broken loose from the coffin during the theft. Inspector Rawlings dismissed it as a common gemstone, but something about it troubled me. The surface. Feel it, Mr. Holmes. It is not like any sapphire I have ever touched." Holmes took the disc between his thumb and forefinger and held it to the window. He turned it slowly, studying the way the light passed through its body. Then he drew from his coat pocket a small folding lens, the same lens I'd seen him use 1,000 times over crime scenes and corpses alike, and examined the stone with an attention so absolute that the world beyond it ceased to exist. "Watson," he said at last, and his voice carried a note I had not heard before. Not excitement, precisely, but the quiet, controlled thrill of a man who has stumbled upon something far larger than he anticipated. "Come here and tell me what you see." I took the lens and peered at the stone. To my untrained eye, it appeared flawless, a disc of deep, translucent blue without blemish or inclusion. "It is a very fine sapphire," I offered. "It is nothing of the kind." Holmes reclaimed the stone and held it up so that the light struck its edge. "A natural sapphire, however fine, contains inclusions, needle-like crystals of rutile, known in the trade as silk. This stone has none. Moreover, the cut is not lapidary work. It is ground with a precision measurable in thousandths of an inch. the sort of work performed not by jewellers but by instrument makers. This, Watson, is not a gemstone. It is a component. A component of what? Holmes wrapped the disc carefully in the handkerchief and returned it to Lord Pembroke. His eyes had taken on that dangerous, glittering quality that I had learned to associate with cases that would consume him entirely. That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we are going to find out. Lord Pembroke, your ancestor, did not decorate a box with pretty stones. He built a mechanism, and whoever stole it understood that far better than you or Inspector Rawlings. He turned back to the window, and his next words were spoken so softly that I barely caught them above the rhythm of the wheels. The question is not merely who broke into your crypt. The question is who told them what the coffin truly is. The train plunged into a tunnel and darkness swallowed us whole. When we emerged again into the pale Hampshire morning, Holmes was smiling, a thin, sharp smile that held no warmth in it whatsoever. We were 20 minutes from St. Dunstan's. Chapter 3. The Silent Crypt, the Village of Ashworth. St. Dunstan lay in a shallow fold of the Hampshire Downs, a quiet, unremarkable place of thatched cottages and flint walls that seemed to have been forgotten by the march of progress entirely. The church of St. Dunstan's itself stood upon a low rise at the eastern edge of the village, its Norman tower dark against the leaden sky, its churchyard a dense thicket of mossy headstones, leaning at drunken angles like old soldiers too weary to stand at attention. Inspector Rawlings met us at the lich gate, a stout, red-faced man with mutton-chop whiskers and the cautiously optimistic expression of a spaniel who has been told that reinforcements are coming, but is not entirely sure what form they will take. "Mr. Holmes," he said, extending a thick hand. "I won't pretend I'm not relieved to see you, sir. This business has got quite beyond me, and I'm man enough to say so. The Chief Constable suggested I send for Scotland Yard, but Lord Pembroke insisted upon you, and I confess I've read Dr. Watson's accounts with considerable interest." "You are too kind, Inspector," Holmes replied with a brevity that bordered on dismissal. "The crypt, if you please. I should prefer to examine it before the light fails entirely." Rawlings led us along a gravel path that wound between the graves toward the eastern end of the church, where a heavy oak door set into the stonework marked the entrance to the Pembroke family crypt. Two constables stood guard, stamping their feet against the cold. Holmes ignored them entirely and dropped to his knees before the threshold with the eager intensity of a hound upon a fresh scent. The door itself had not been forced. Holmes examined the lock, a heavy, old-fashioned ward lock of Victorian manufacture, for a full 3 minutes before straightening. "This lock has been opened with a key," he announced. "There are no pick marks, no scratches upon the ward plate, no sign of forced manipulation whatsoever. Either the thief possessed the original key or had access to a precise duplicate. Inspector, how many keys exist for this door?" Rawlings consulted his notebook. "Two, sir. One held by Lord Pembroke himself, the other kept in the vestry safe by the Reverend Alderton." "And both are accounted for?" "Lord Pembroke's key is on his person. The vestry key was found in the safe, undisturbed." Holmes said nothing, but I saw his lips compress into a thin line. A lock opened without force, with both keys accounted for. This was no opportunistic burglary. Someone had obtained a third key, which meant someone had first obtained access to one of the originals long enough to make an impression. We descended a flight of worn stone steps into the crypt. The air below was cold and heavy with the mineral scent of ancient stone and something else. Something faintly metallic that I could not immediately identify. Rawlings had provided oil lanterns, and their wavering light revealed a low vaulted chamber lined with stone sarcophagi bearing the carved effigies of Pembroke's long dead. At the far end of the crypt, a section of wall had been reduced to rubble. The stones lay scattered across the floor in a pattern that Holmes studied with intense concentration, moving among them as carefully as a man crossing a minefield. "Watson, come here. Tell me what you observe about these stones." I crouched beside him. "They have been pulled outward," I said, noting the direction in which the debris had fallen. The wall was broken from the inside. "From the alcove side, yes, but not from the inside in the way you mean. Someone stood precisely where you are standing now and used a lever or pry bar to extract the stones systematically, beginning with the keystone at the top of the arch. This was not demolition, Watson. It was disassembly, each stone removed in sequence, with care taken not to damage the surrounding structure. Our thief is either a mason by trade or possesses a thorough understanding of stonework." He directed his lantern into the alcove beyond the broken wall. The space was small, no larger than a cupboard, and empty save for a stone shelf upon which the sapphire coffin had evidently rested for over a century. Holmes ran his fingers along the shelf, then brought them to his nose. "The blue dust again," he murmured. "Corundum powder, consistent with the sapphire disc Lord Pembroke showed us on the train. But there is something else here." He withdrew his folding lens and bent so low that his nose nearly touched the stone. For perhaps 2 minutes he examined the shelf in absolute silence. Then he turned to me, and even in the dim lantern light I could see the sharp gleam of discovery in his eyes. "Scratches, Watson. Fine, parallel scratches upon the stone surface. Not random, but deliberate. Someone has traced markings into this shelf with a pointed instrument. They are faint and partially obscured by dust, but they are unquestionably intentional." "What sort of markings?" "Measurements. Someone measured this shelf, its exact dimensions, its depth, the position of the coffin upon it, with considerable precision. And they did so before the wall was broken. These scratches are old, Watson. They predate the theft by months, possibly years. Whoever stole the sapphire coffin visited this alcove at least once before, when the wall was still intact. A cold certainty settled upon me. Then the wall must have been opened before and sealed again. Precisely. Holmes straightened and fixed Lord Pembroke, who had been watching from the foot of the stairs with an expression of mounting distress, with a penetrating stare. "Lord Pembroke, has the crypt wall been opened at any point in your lifetime?" "Never," Pembroke said firmly. "Not in my father's lifetime either. The wall was inspected in 1871 when my grandfather was interred, and it was found intact." "Then someone gained access to that alcove without Lord Pembroke's knowledge," Holmes said softly, almost to himself. "Measured the coffin's resting place, made a key to the crypt door, and returned later to claim the prize. This was not a crime of opportunity, gentlemen. This was a campaign planned over months, perhaps years, by a person with intimate knowledge of both the crypt and the coffin." He turned on his heel and walked toward the crypt entrance, pausing at the precise spot where, according to Rawlings, the caretaker's body had been discovered. He knelt once more, and I watched him examine the flagstones with the same minute attention he had given everything else. "The body has been removed naturally," Holmes said. "Inspector, your report states that Craddock's neck was broken. Was there any other injury?" "None that the surgeon noted, sir. Clean break of the cervical vertebrae. Quick death," he said. "And the position of the body?" "Face down, sir. Arms at his sides. Lantern smashed beside him." Holmes rose slowly. His expression had changed. The eager hunter had given way to something colder and more deliberate. "A man who falls from a blow lands with his arms outstretched. It is an instinct as old as humanity itself. A man who is found face down with his arms at his sides did not fall. He was placed. Our killer broke Craddock's neck, laid him out with almost ceremonial care, and positioned him as one might position a body in a coffin." He paused, and when he spoke again, His voice was barely above a whisper. "We are dealing with someone methodical, knowledgeable, and entirely without mercy, and I am now quite certain, Watson, that poor Thomas Craddock was not killed because he surprised a thief. He was killed because he knew something, and that something died with him." The lantern guttered in a draught from the stairwell, and for an instant the crypt was plunged into darkness. When the flame recovered, Holmes was already ascending the steps, his coat billowing behind him like the wing of some great dark bird. As we emerged into the grey afternoon light, I noticed a figure standing some distance away among the headstones, a young man, dark-haired and lean, in a well-cut but modest coat. He appeared to be sketching in a small notebook, and I took him for an artist drawn to the picturesque melancholy of the churchyard. He glanced up at our party with an expression of polite curiosity, and I thought nothing more of it. Holmes, however, paused. His gaze lingered upon the young man for perhaps 3 seconds, no more, before he turned away with a faintly puzzled expression that vanished as quickly as it had come. "Come, Watson, we have suspects to interview, and the day is not getting any younger." Chapter 4. The Collector of Curiosities. We took luncheon at the village inn, a modest establishment called the Crown and Anchor, where Holmes ate nothing but drank 3 cups of black coffee in rapid succession, while filling the margins of his pocket notebook with annotations so small and densely packed that I could not read them from across the table. Lord Pembroke, who had remained largely silent since our descent into the crypt, picked at a plate of cold mutton with the mechanical indifference of a man whose appetite had been buried alongside his ancestors. It was here that Inspector Rawlings, with the earnest thoroughness that was his most admirable quality, presented us with the fruits of his investigation thus far. He produced a battered leather portfolio and spread its contents across the table between the salt cellar and the mustard pot. "I've made inquiries into 4 individuals, Mr. Holmes, each of whom had reason to know about the coffin's existence and location. I'll not pretend my methods are equal to yours, but I've gathered what I could." Holmes set down his coffee cup. "Proceed, Inspector. I am all attention." "First, there's Mr. Marcus Havelock, the collector Lord Pembroke mentioned. Wealthy man, lives in Belgravia. Made his fortune in South African mining, and has since devoted himself to acquiring what he calls objects of historical significance. The trade knows him by a less charitable name. They call him the Magpie, on account of his habit of acquiring things that other people would rather keep. He offered Lord Pembroke £5,000 for the coffin 6 weeks ago and was refused. His whereabouts on the night of the theft? Claims he was at his London residence entertaining guests. I've written to confirm, but haven't yet received replies from the guests in question. A dinner party is the easiest alibi to manufacture and the hardest to disprove, Holmes observed. Continue. Second, Captain Reginald Pembroke, his lordship's cousin and the only other surviving member of the direct Pembroke line. He's a military man, currently on half pay, and by all accounts living well beyond his means. He has debts with 3 separate moneylenders in the city, and his club membership is 6 months in arrears. He stands to inherit Thornfield if Lord Pembroke dies without issue. Pembroke stirred uncomfortably. Reginald is reckless with money, Inspector, but he is family. I cannot believe he would... We are not yet in the business of belief, Lord Pembroke, Holmes interrupted gently. We are in the business of facts. Inspector, Captain Pembroke's whereabouts? Unknown, sir. His London lodgings report that he departed 4 days before the theft and has not returned. No forwarding address. Holmes's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only indication of surprise I'd ever known him to display. A missing cousin with debts and expectations. How remarkably convenient. Next. Third, Mr. Josiah Hartwell, the family solicitor, senior partner at Hartwell and Crane, Lincoln's Inn. He has managed the Pembroke estate for 23 years and has complete access to the family papers, including the crypt diagrams. Impeccable reputation. Church-going man, wife and 4 children in Hampstead. Which tells us nothing whatsoever about his capacity for crime, Holmes said. An impeccable reputation is merely a wall, Inspector, and walls exist to hide what lies behind them. Does Hartwell have any financial irregularities? None that I've found. His firm's accounts appear sound. Appear, Holmes repeated, and let the word hang in the air like smoke. And fourth, Professor Elias Vane of the British Museum, specialist in colonial-era artefacts, particularly those associated with the East India Company. He wrote to Lord Pembroke requesting access to the coffin for academic study. The correspondence lasted 3 months, growing increasingly insistent before Lord Pembroke terminated it. I have the letters at Thornfield, Pembroke confirmed. The man's tone bordered on obsessive. He claimed the coffin was of immense historical importance, and that keeping it sealed was, I recall his phrase exactly, an act of vandalism against the historical record. Holmes was silent for a long moment. He had taken the sapphire disc from his pocket and was turning it slowly between his fingers, watching the pale light catch its surface. 4 suspects, he said at last. A collector who covets the object, a cousin who needs money desperately, a solicitor who holds the keys to the kingdom, and a scholar who believes the coffin belongs to history rather than to one family. He placed the sapphire disc upon the table and regarded it as a chess master might regard a board in the middle game. Each has motive, each has some degree of access, and yet the crime itself, the duplicate key, the precise disassembly of the wall, the measured shelf, the careful positioning of the body, speaks of a single quality that overshadows all others. And what quality is that? I asked. Patience, Watson. Extraordinary, calculated, almost inhuman patience. This crime was not committed in a fever of greed or desperation. It was cultivated, tended like a garden, over a very long period of time. And that tells me something crucial about our killer. He pocketed the sapphire and rose from the table. It tells me that the motive is not what it appears to be. A man who spends years planning a theft does not do so for money. Money is urgent, money cannot wait. Nor does he do so for academic curiosity. Scholars publish, they do not murder. No, our killer wants what is inside the coffin, and he wants it badly enough to have shaped his entire life around the moment of its acquisition. He reached for his hat and coat. Come, Watson. I believe it is time we paid a visit to the British Museum. Professor Vane and I have a great deal to discuss, and I fancy he will find my questions rather less polite than Lord Pembroke's refusals. As we stepped out of the Crown and Anchor into the village lane, I saw, for the second time that day, the young dark-haired man from the churchyard. He was seated upon a low wall across the lane, sketching once more in his notebook, or appearing to sketch. As our party emerged, he raised his head with an expression of mild interest, and for a moment his gaze met mine. His eyes were dark and remarkably steady, and they held an intelligence that struck me as unusual for a casual artist on a country ramble. He inclined his head in a small, courteous nod, then returned to his drawing. I mentioned the encounter to Holmes as we walked toward the station. He stopped abruptly. Describe him? Young, 30 at the outside, Indian, I believe, or at least of Indian heritage. Well dressed, but not ostentatiously so. He was sketching in a notebook, or seemed to be. You saw him at the churchyard as well? Standing among the headstones when we emerged from the crypt. Holmes said nothing, but I saw his jaw tighten, a reaction so slight that only a man who had studied that face for years would have recognized it as alarm. A man who appears twice at the periphery of a crime scene, he murmured, is either a very unlucky bystander or a very careful observer. I should have paid closer attention the first time. Note it, Watson. Note everything about him. The afternoon train to London awaited, and with it the widening of an investigation that I was beginning to suspect would prove darker and more far-reaching than any of us yet imagined. Chapter 5. The Sapphire That Was Not a Jewel. The British Museum on a grey November afternoon possesses a particular quality of silence, not the warm, companionable quiet of a library, but the vast, watchful hush of a cathedral built to house the plundered glories of civilizations that no longer exist to protest their absence. Holmes moved through its halls with the purposeful stride of a man who knew precisely where he was going, and I followed in his wake, dodging display cases and startled attendants with considerably less grace. Professor Elias Vane occupied a cramped office on the third floor of the museum's east wing, a room so densely packed with books, papers, and artifacts that entering it felt rather like forcing one's way into the burrow of some particularly acquisitive badger. The man himself was small and wiry, perhaps 60 years of age, with a sharp, angular face dominated by spectacles of extraordinary thickness, and a beard that appeared to have been trimmed by someone in a considerable hurry. He rose from behind a fortress of manuscripts as we entered, and his expression upon recognizing Lord Pembroke shifted through surprise, annoyance, and something I could not immediately identify, before settling into a mask of professional courtesy. "Lord Pembroke, this is unexpected, and you are." "Sherlock Holmes," said Holmes, without offering his hand. "And this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We are investigating the theft of the Sapphire Coffin and the murder of Thomas Craddock, and I should be grateful for 15 minutes of your time, though I suspect I shall require rather less." Vane removed his spectacles, polished them unnecessarily, and replaced them. It was, I noted, the gesture of a man buying time to compose his thoughts. "A dreadful business," he said carefully. "I read of the caretaker's death in the Hampshire papers. Naturally, I was distressed to learn of the coffin's theft as well. It is an object of considerable academic importance. So, you have stated, at length and repeatedly in your correspondence with Lord Pembroke," Holmes said. He had not taken the offered chair, but stood in the centre of the room, turning slowly, his eyes cataloguing every object on every surface, with that relentless, consuming attention that missed nothing. "Professor, I notice you have a remarkable collection of colonial-era instruments on that shelf behind you. Indian, if I'm not mistaken. 18th century. Vane glanced over his shoulder. "You have a good eye, Mr. Holmes. Yes, those are navigational instruments from the Madras Presidency. Part of my research into the material culture of the East India Company. And the sapphire bearings within them. You are familiar with the use of industrial sapphire in precision mechanisms of that period?" Something changed in Vane's face. It was subtle, a momentary tightening of the muscles around the jaw, a fractional widening of the eyes behind those thick lenses. But Holmes saw it, and I saw Holmes see it, and in that instant I understood that the question had struck far closer to the mark than the Professor had anticipated. "I am familiar with the practice, yes," Vane said slowly. "Corundum was used extensively in clockwork, navigational instruments, and certain types of—" He stopped himself. "Mr. Holmes, what exactly are you suggesting?" Holmes withdrew the sapphire disc from his pocket and placed it upon Vane's desk without ceremony. The stone sat upon a scattered page of manuscript like a single blue eye staring upward at the ceiling. "I am suggesting nothing, Professor. I'm asking you to examine this object and tell me what it is." Vane picked up the disc. His hands, I noticed, were perfectly steady, but his breathing had changed. He held the stone to the lamp upon his desk and studied it through a jeweller's loop that he produced from a drawer with the practised ease of long familiarity. The silence stretched. When Vane finally spoke, his voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper. "This is a sapphire bearing? Synthetic? No, not synthetic. Natural corundum, but shaped by mechanical means. The tolerances are extraordinary for the period. This is not jewellery, Mr. Holmes. This is a component of a locking mechanism, and a remarkably sophisticated one." "As I suspected," Holmes said quietly. "And now, Professor, I should like you to tell me precisely how you arrived at that conclusion so quickly. Because a man who can identify a sapphire bearing at a glance is a man who has spent considerable time thinking about the specific mechanism from which it came." Vane set the disc down upon his desk. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he removed his spectacles entirely and rubbed his eyes with a weariness that seemed to age him 10 years in the space of a breath. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. I've not been entirely forthcoming, not with Lord Pembroke, and not with you. My interest in the Sapphire Coffin is not purely academic. I believe I know what the coffin is, and I believe I know what it contains." Holmes did not move. "Continue." "In 1791, 2 years before Colonel Pembroke took the coffin from the Dorai Temple, a British officer named Major James Whitford was court-martialed in Madras for the massacre of 43 civilians during a punitive raid on a village suspected of harbouring enemy supplies. Whitford was acquitted. The testimony of the Indian witnesses was dismissed as unreliable, and the British officers who might have corroborated their accounts were either transferred or quietly pensioned off. He paused and met Holmes's gaze directly. "I have spent 11 years researching this case, Mr. Holmes. I believe the Sapphire Coffin contains the testimony of those officers, written depositions proving that Major Whitford acted on direct orders from his commanding officer, Colonel Horatio Pembroke. The massacre was not Whitford's crime, it was Pembroke's, and the coffin was built not to preserve a treasure, but to seal away the evidence of a war crime that the British government conspired to bury." The room fell silent. Lord Pembroke, who had remained standing by the door throughout this exchange, had gone the colour of chalk. "That is a lie," he said hoarsely. "My ancestor was a decorated officer. He served with distinction." "He served with brutality," Vane said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only the flat, exhausted conviction of a man who has lived with an ugly truth for too long. "And the proof was locked inside a box of sapphires and hidden in a crypt for 100 years. Holmes held up a hand, silencing them. Both. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with an intensity that I had rarely seen equalled. "Professor Vane, your theory is detailed, compelling, and may very well be correct. It also provides you with an extraordinarily powerful motive for stealing the coffin yourself. You have spent 11 years searching for evidence that would make your academic reputation, and 3 months ago you were denied access to the one object that could prove your thesis." Vane opened his mouth to protest, but Holmes had already turned toward the door. As he did so, however, he paused, and his eye fell upon a framed photograph hanging on the far wall of Vane's office. It was a group portrait, the sort taken at academic conferences or departmental gatherings. A dozen scholars arranged in formal rows, Vane himself seated in the centre of the front row. But it was not Vane who arrested Holmes's attention. Standing at the end of the back row, half obscured by the man beside him, was a young, dark-haired figure whose face I recognised instantly. It was the man from the churchyard, the man from the village lane. Holmes stepped closer to the photograph. "Your departmental staff, Professor?" "Taken last spring," Vane said with the forced casualness of a man who does not understand why the question is being asked. "And the young man at the end of the back row?" Vane glanced at the photograph as if seeing it for the first time. "That is Dr. Sarangi, Anand Sarangi, my research fellow, specialist in Indian temple mechanisms, a brilliant young man, quite the most gifted I have worked with." Holmes's expression did not change by so much as a fraction, but I felt the temperature in the room drop by several degrees. He held my gaze for a single weighted instant, a look that said, as clearly as words, "Remember this name." "I do not yet know whether you are a witness, a suspect, or merely a very dedicated scholar," Holmes said to Vane, his voice perfectly level. "But I intend to find out. Good afternoon, Professor." We descended the museum steps into the fading afternoon light. Holmes walked in silence for the length of 2 streets before he spoke. "Watson, we now have a 5th possibility that none of us had considered." "And what is that?" "That the sapphire coffin was not stolen to possess what is inside, but to destroy it. Someone may be protecting the Pembroke name not out of loyalty, but out of complicity. If Vane is right, and those depositions exist, then the descendants of every officer involved in that cover-up have reason to want them reduced to ashes." He hailed a passing hansom with a sharp whistle. "The game has changed, Watson. We are no longer looking for a thief. We are looking for someone who would kill to keep the dead silent, and I fear they are not yet finished." He paused with one foot upon the cab step and turned back to me with that expression of iron focus that meant every word was to be memorized. "And Watson, the man you saw sketching in the churchyard, Dr. Anand Sarangi, a research fellow who studies Indian temple mechanisms, employed by a professor obsessed with the sapphire coffin, and he was in Hampshire on the day we examined the crypt. He was not sketching the scenery, my dear fellow. He was sketching us." Chapter 6. The Hidden Mechanism. We returned to Baker Street that evening in a state of considerable agitation, or rather, I was agitated, while Holmes had retreated into that impenetrable fortress of thought which rendered him as communicative as a sphinx carved from granite. He had not spoken a word since Montague Street, and upon entering our rooms he went directly to the bookcase, pulled down 3 volumes in rapid succession, a Gazetteer of India, Doyle's History of the East India Company Campaigns, and a slim monograph on precision instrument making that I had never seen him consult before, and arranged them upon the floor beside his chair in a semicircle that reminded me uncomfortably of a séance. I knew better than to interrupt. I occupied myself with the evening papers and a pipe, keeping one eye upon Holmes as the hours crawled past. Mrs. Hudson brought supper at 8. It went untouched. The fire burned low, and I rebuilt it twice. The clock upon the mantelpiece struck 9, then 10, then 11, each chime falling into the silence of the room like a stone dropped into deep water. At 11:15, Holmes spoke. "I have been a fool, Watson." I lowered my paper. In all our years together, I could count upon one hand the number of times Sherlock Holmes had applied that word to himself, and each occasion had preceded a breakthrough of considerable magnitude. "The sapphire disc," he continued, rising from his chair and crossing to the deal-top table where he had laid the stone earlier that afternoon. I identified it correctly as a component, a bearing from a locking mechanism, but I failed to ask the obvious question, not what it is, but how many there are. He picked up the disc and held it to the lamplight. Lord Pembroke described the coffin as encrusted with sapphires of extraordinary size and colour. "Plural, Watson. A locking mechanism requires bearings, yes, but a simple lock requires 2, perhaps 3. A coffin covered in sapphires suggests dozens. Why would a lock require dozens of identical precision-ground bearings?" "Because it is not a simple lock," I ventured. "Because it is not a lock at all." Holmes set the disc down and began to pace, that rapid, restless circuit of the room that preceded his most penetrating deductions, his dressing-gown billowing behind him like a banner. Consider the evidence in sequence. Colonel Pembroke was a military man stationed in India during a period when British instrument makers were producing the most sophisticated mechanical devices in the world. Chronometers, calculating engines, cipher machines. He acquired an object from a temple, an object the priest called the Sleeping Jewel, and he brought it to England not as a trophy but as a vessel for testimony. He stopped before the fireplace and turned to face me. Now ask yourself, if you possessed written depositions proving that you had ordered the massacre of 43 civilians, and you wished to ensure those depositions could never be read by anyone who did not possess very specific knowledge, what would you do? You would not simply lock them away. Any lock can be picked. Any wall can be broken. You would build a mechanism that destroys the contents if opened incorrectly. The implications settled upon me with the weight of cold iron. A trap. A self-destroying archive. The sapphires are not decoration, Watson, and they are not merely bearings for a lock. They are components of a sequential mechanism, a puzzle that must be solved in a precise order to access what lies within. Open it incorrectly and the contents are obliterated. Burned, most likely. The Colonel would have had access to incendiary compounds through his military connections. The coffin is not a box with a lid. It is a machine designed to protect its secret with absolute finality. He snatched up the monograph on instrument making and thrust it toward me, open to a page illustrating the internal mechanisms of an 18th century astronomical clock. Look at the bearing configuration. Sapphire bearings arranged in concentric rings, each one governing the movement of a sequential gear. Now multiply that principle by the number of sapphires on the coffin, and you begin to understand the complexity of what Colonel Pembroke constructed, or rather, what he commissioned someone to construct. But who could build such a thing? An instrument maker of the highest caliber, and in 1793 there were perhaps 5 men in England capable of the work. Holmes crossed to his bookcase and withdrew a directory I recognized as his index of biographies, that vast personal encyclopedia in which he catalogued every person of interest he had ever encountered or researched. He flipped through the pages with practiced speed. Here, Josiah Blackwood, master instrument maker, premises in Clerkenwell, active from 1780 to 1802, specialist in astronomical and navigational devices, known to have supplied instruments to the East India Company and, this is the crucial detail, Watson, known to have accepted private commissions from military officers returning from India. He died in 1802, and his workshop was purchased by a firm that later became... He stopped. His finger, which had been tracing a line of his own cramped handwriting, went perfectly still. "Watson," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice I had never heard before. Not excitement, not triumph, but the cold, electric clarity of a man who has seen, for the first time, the true shape of the thing he has been hunting. The firm that purchased Blackwood's workshop and all his papers, including his commission ledgers, was Hartwell and Associates, the predecessor firm of Hartwell and Crane, Lincoln's Inn. The name struck me like a physical blow. The family solicitor. The family solicitor, Holmes repeated. Josiah Hartwell's grandfather did not merely inherit a legal practice, Watson. He inherited the blueprints, the precise mechanical specifications for every device Josiah Blackwood ever built, including, I would wager my reputation upon it, the Sapphire Coffin. He closed the index and stood motionless for a long moment, his shadow thrown tall and sharp against the wall by the dying fire. Now I understand the patience. Now I understand the duplicate key, the measurements scratched into the crypt shelf, the meticulous disassembly of the wall. Hartwell did not merely know where the coffin was hidden. He knew what it was. He knew how it worked. And he knew, because his family has possessed the blueprints for, over 90 years, exactly how to open it without triggering the mechanism that would destroy everything inside. He turned to me, and the light in his eyes was fierce and terrible. "We have been looking for a thief, Watson, but what we have found is an heir. Josiah Hartwell has been waiting his entire professional life for this moment, serving the Pembroke family, guarding their secrets, biding his time until the hour was right to claim the one thing his grandfather's firm built and the Pembrokes buried. The question that remains is the darkest one of all. What does he intend to do with it? Precisely. Does he mean to protect the Pembroke name, or to destroy it? And is there anyone left alive who might stop him? The fire collapsed into embers with a soft, defeated sigh. Holmes reached for his pipe, and the match flared briefly in the darkness, like a warning. Tomorrow, Watson, we visit Lincoln's Inn, and I think it would be wise to bring your revolver. Chapter 7. The Midnight Buyer. The offices of Hartwell and Crane occupied a handsome Georgian building at the southern end of Lincoln's Inn Fields, its facade of Portland stone projecting an air of solidity and discretion that had doubtless reassured generations of wealthy clients. Holmes and I arrived at 9:30 the following morning, only to be informed by a clerk of funereal bearing that Mr. Josiah Hartwell was not in the office, and was not expected until the afternoon, having departed the previous evening for what the clerk described, with the careful neutrality of the professionally discreet, as a matter of private business. Holmes received this information with a smile that would have unsettled a less practised man. "How very inconvenient," he said pleasantly. "And where might we find Mr. Hartwell in the meantime?" "I am not at liberty to disclose Mr. Hartwell's private arrangements, sir." "No, I don't suppose you are." "Watson, we shall wait." We did not wait. The moment we had descended the front steps, Holmes seized my arm and steered me around the corner into a narrow lane that ran behind the building. His eyes were alight with that dangerous, predatory energy that always signalled the transition from deduction to action. "Hartwell has gone to ground, Watson, and a solicitor does not abandon his office on a weekday morning without compelling reason. Something has forced his hand, something that has happened since our visit to Professor Vane yesterday, which means either Vane has warned him or Hartwell has his own sources of information regarding our investigation." "What do you propose?" "I propose that we discover where Mr. Hartwell conducts his private business. Fortunately, I have resources that the Hampshire Constabulary does not." Within the hour, Holmes had dispatched 3 telegrams to persons he did not identify, and we had returned to Baker Street to await replies. The first arrived at noon from an individual, Holmes addressed only as Langdale, and its contents produced in my companion a reaction of grim satisfaction. The second arrived 20 minutes later, and deepened that satisfaction into certainty. The third did not come by telegram at all, but by way of a filthy street urchin who appeared at our door with a folded note and departed with a shilling and a conspiratorial grin that suggested a long and profitable acquaintance with the detective's methods. "The irregulars never disappoint," Holmes murmured, reading the note. "Watson, our evening is spoken for. Mr. Josiah Hartwell will be attending a private auction tonight at an address in Limehouse, an establishment known to a select clientele as the Dorado Rooms. It is, I am informed, a venue where certain antiquities change hands with a minimum of paperwork and a maximum of discretion, and the principal item for sale this evening." He handed me the note. The handwriting was atrocious, but the message was unmistakable. "The Sapphire Coffin," I breathed. "The Sapphire Coffin. It would appear, Watson, that someone has decided to sell our quarry before we can recover it, and Hartwell intends to be the buyer. The question is whether he means to purchase it for himself or on behalf of another party. Either way, we shall be in attendance. I trust you have no objection to spending an evening among London's less reputable antiquarians." I confess that I had considerable objections, but I voiced none of them. By 8:30 that evening we had transformed ourselves, or rather, Holmes had transformed us both, into plausible facsimiles of the sort of men who frequented underground auctions in Limehouse. Holmes wore a threadbare frock coat, a battered top hat, and a pair of spectacles with green-tinted lenses that altered the character of his face so completely that I should have passed him in the street without recognition. My own disguise was simpler, a heavy merchant's overcoat and a false moustache that itched abominably, but Holmes pronounced it adequate for the purpose. The Dorado Rooms proved to be a cellar beneath a ship chandler's shop on Narrow Street, accessible through a door that bore no marking and responded only to a sequence of knocks that Holmes had obtained through channels he did not explain. We descended a flight of brick steps into a low, vaulted space illuminated by gas lamps, turned to their dimmest setting, the air thick with cigar smoke and the mingled scents of damp stone, old wood, and something sweeter. Opium, I suspected, though its source was not immediately apparent. Perhaps 30 men occupied the room, arranged in a rough semicircle around a raised platform upon which objects were presented for sale by a tall, cadaverous auctioneer whose face bore the permanent expression of a man who has long since ceased to be surprised by anything. The clientele was a study in contrasts. Wealthy collectors in evening dress rubbed shoulders with him, sharp-eyed dealers in rumpled suits, and here and there I spotted faces that belonged more naturally to the criminal docks at the Old Bailey than to any auction room. Holmes guided me to a position near the back wall, where the shadows were deepest and our faces least visible. He had adopted the slouching posture and vacant expression of a man of modest means, attending out of curiosity rather than intent, but I could feel the tension in him, every muscle coiled, every sense straining. We endured the sale of several items, a Byzantine icon of doubtful provenance, a set of Ottoman daggers, a jade carving that the auctioneer attributed to the Ming dynasty, with a confidence that invited scepticism before the object we had come to see was brought forward. It was smaller than I had imagined, no larger than a lady's writing case, as Lord Pembroke had described, and fashioned from dark wood, ebony, I thought, in the unmistakable shape of a miniature coffin, but it was the sapphires that arrested the eye and held it captive. They covered every surface, set into the wood in concentric patterns of extraordinary intricacy, each stone ground to the same flat, precise disc shape as the bearing Holmes had examined. In the dim gaslight, they glowed with a deep, cold fire that seemed almost to pulse, as though the object possessed its own heartbeat. A murmur passed through the room. Even among men accustomed to handling stolen treasures, the sapphire coffin commanded attention. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced in a voice drained of all inflection. A coffin-form reliquary of Indian origin, late 18th century, set with natural corundum bearings in a sequential mechanical configuration. Provenance, private collection, Devonshire. The vendor requests a starting bid of £1,000. Holmes's hand closed upon my wrist. He had spotted something, or someone, across the room. I followed his gaze and saw standing in the opposite corner, with his hat pulled low and his collar turned up against recognition, a figure I had last seen in the comfortable surroundings of the Crown and Anchor in Ashworth Street, Dunstan. It was not Josiah Hartwell. It was Captain Reginald Pembroke, the missing cousin, the man with debts and expectations, the man who had vanished 4 days before the theft and whom Inspector Rawlings had been unable to locate. He was very much present now, and he was bidding. The auction proceeded with the swift, ruthless efficiency of all such illicit transactions. Bids rose rapidly, 1,200, 1,500, 2,000, and I watched Captain Pembroke's face grow increasingly desperate as each raise carried the price further beyond what a man of his ruined finances could possibly command. At £3,000 he faltered. At 3,500 he stopped bidding entirely, and I saw his hand move involuntarily toward the inside pocket of his coat in a gesture that chilled me to the marrow. But it was not the captain who held my attention in that moment. It was a figure near the side of the room, a man I had not noticed upon our arrival, who stood apart from the bidders with the composed stillness of someone watching a play whose ending he already knew. He was young and dark-haired, and even in the dim gaslight, even half concealed by shadow, I recognized him. Dr. Anand Sarangi was in the Dorado rooms. He was not bidding. He was not even watching the coffin. He was watching Hartwell. I gripped Holmes's arm, but his slight nod told me he had already seen. The winning bid, £4,200, came from a man seated near the front of the room. He was unremarkable in every visible respect, middle-aged, tidily dressed with a composed, watchful expression of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted without raising his voice. When he rose to claim his purchase, Holmes drew a sharp breath beside me. "Hartwell," he whispered, "in the flesh. He has come himself. He trusts no intermediary with this." The auctioneer opened the coffin for the buyer's inspection. The room craned forward, and in that moment of collective anticipation, I saw Hartwell's expression change, from satisfaction to confusion, and from confusion to something approaching alarm. The coffin was empty. Not merely empty of treasure or documents, empty of mechanism. The interior was lined with bare wood, unmarked and unadorned. Where there should have been a mechanical compartment, a hidden panel, a sequential lock of sapphire bearings, there was nothing. The coffin was a shell. Hartwell turned the object over in his hands, his composure fracturing visibly. He pressed the sapphires in what appeared to be a deliberate sequence. Nothing happened. He tried again, varying the order. Nothing. I looked for Sarangi. The place where he had stood was empty. He had vanished the moment the coffin was opened, slipped away like smoke through the crowd while every eye was fixed upon the empty shell. Holmes was already moving toward the door. "Quickly, Watson. We must leave before the room turns ugly." We gained the stairs and emerged into the cold night air of Narrow Street. Holmes walked rapidly toward the main road, his disguise already half discarded, and when he finally stopped beneath a gas lamp, his face wore an expression I had seldom seen. Not triumph, not frustration, but the fierce, burning focus of a man who has just realized that the puzzle is far more complex than he had believed. "The mechanism has been removed," he said. "Someone opened the coffin before it reached the auction. Someone who understood its construction well enough to extract the internal works without damaging the exterior. Hartwell came to buy the complete object and found an empty shell." He stared into the fog, and the gaslight carved his features into a mask of absolute concentration. But it was not Hartwell who was the intended buyer tonight, Watson. The entire auction was staged, a theatre designed to draw Hartwell into the open while the true prize was spirited away under cover of the performance. Sarangi was there. He was watching, and when the coffin was opened empty, he was not surprised. He was satisfied. He turned to me, and his eyes burned in the gaslight. "The coffin is bait. The mechanism is the prize. And Sarangi is not merely one move ahead of us. He wrote the game." Chapter 8. The True Secret of the Coffin. We sat in silence in the hansom that carried us back to Baker Street, the fog pressing against the windows like grey gauze. Holmes had not spoken since Narrow Street, and his stillness was of a quality I had learned to respect. Not the vacancy of defeat, but the charged, electric quiet of a mind working at velocities beyond the reach of ordinary men. It was only when we had regained the warmth of our sitting room, and I had poured 2 glasses of whisky that neither of us particularly wanted, that he finally broke the silence. "I've made an error, Watson, a fundamental error. I assumed that the mechanism inside the coffin was the key to this affair, and I was correct, but I assumed that the person who understood the mechanism must be Hartwell, and in that I was wrong. Or rather, I was incomplete." He stood before the mantelpiece, his fingers drumming a restless tattoo upon the wood, his gaze fixed upon the skull that occupied its customary position between the clock and the gasogene. Consider the sequence of events as we now know them. The coffin was stolen from the crypt by someone with a duplicate key and expert knowledge of stonework. It was transported to London and placed for sale at an underground auction. But before the auction, the internal mechanism, the sequential lock, the hidden compartment, everything that made the coffin more than a decorative shell, was removed by someone with sufficient understanding of its construction to extract the works without damaging them. Could Hartwell not have arranged both the theft and the extraction before the auction? If Hartwell had already extracted the mechanism, why would he attend the auction at all? He came to buy the complete object. His surprise at finding it empty was genuine. I watched his hands, Watson, and they told me what his face attempted to conceal. No. Hartwell purchased the shell believing he was acquiring the whole. Someone intercepted the coffin between the theft and the sale, removed the mechanism, and allowed the empty shell to proceed to auction as though nothing had changed. He turned from the mantelpiece and began to pace. Now, who possesses the knowledge to disassemble a sequential sapphire mechanism of 18th century design? Hartwell has the blueprints through his family's acquisition of Blackwood's workshop papers. Professor VIII has spent 11 years studying colonial instruments and identified the sapphire bearing at a glance. But there is a third possibility, and I have been criminally slow to see it, despite the evidence appearing before my eyes 3 times. He stopped and fixed me with a look of such intensity that I felt pinned to my chair. Dr. Anand Sarangi, a man trained in both engineering and history at Cambridge, a specialist in Indian temple mechanisms, employed by a professor who has spent a decade studying this very artifact, a man who appeared at the churchyard on the morning we examined the crypt, observing our investigation, a man who appeared at the Crown and Anchor while we discussed the suspects, observing our suspects, and a man who appeared at the Dorado rooms tonight, observing the trap he himself had laid. He stopped before the fireplace and turned to face me. The priests of the Dorai Temple. Colonel Pembroke took the coffin from them in 1793, but he did not build it. The coffin was already a mechanism when he stole it. It was Indian. Craftsmanship. The instrument maker Blackwood may have modified or enhanced the lock, but the fundamental design originated in India. And knowledge, Watson, unlike sapphires, cannot be locked in a crypt. It passes from teacher to student, from generation to generation, preserved in memory long after the physical object has been carried across the sea. A cold realization began to form in my mind. You are suggesting that someone connected to the original temple. I'm suggesting that the theft of the sapphire coffin was not one crime, but 2, committed by 2 separate parties, with 2 entirely different motives. The first party, our killer, who murdered Craddock and broke into the crypt, stole the coffin for the purpose of selling it. The second party intercepted the coffin, extracted the mechanism, and allowed the shell to proceed to auction precisely because the shell was irrelevant to them. They wanted only what was inside. He crossed to the table where the sapphire disc still rested and picked it up, turning it slowly between his fingers. And now I must ask myself a question that I should have asked at the very beginning. Professor VIII told us that the coffin contains depositions proving Colonel Pembroke ordered the massacre of 43 civilians at a village near the Dorai Temple. He presented this as an academic theory. But what if it is not a theory? What if VIII knows because he has been in contact with descendants of those villagers, people for whom those depositions are not academic curiosities, but proof of an atrocity committed against their ancestors? He set the sapphire down with a soft click. VIII's 11 years of research, his obsessive correspondence with Lord Pembroke, his instant recognition of the sapphire bearing. These are not the marks of a dispassionate scholar. They are the marks of a man recruited to a cause. And the man who recruited him is the same man who has been watching us from the shadows since we first set foot in Hampshire. The fire crackled in the grate. I felt the ground shifting beneath my understanding of the entire case, the suspects and motives rearranging themselves like the coloured fragments inside a kaleidoscope. Then, who killed Craddock? I asked. That remains the central question, and it is the one thread that will unravel all the others. The killer is not Sarangi. The man I saw at the churchyard has a scholar's hands, and the murder required military force. The killer is not Hartwell. He arrived at the auction expecting to find the coffin intact, which means he was not present at the theft. Consider who remains. He let the silence hold for 3 beats. Captain Reginald Pembroke, a military man trained to kill quickly and without hesitation, a man drowning in debts to 3 separate moneylenders, a man who vanished 4 days before the theft, and a man who was in that auction room tonight, bidding desperately for an object, which tells us something crucial. He was trying to buy back what he himself had stolen. He was trying to recover the coffin before anyone discovered what he had done, which means he was not the mastermind. He was the instrument. Someone approached Captain Pembroke, offered him enough money to clear his debts in exchange for stealing the coffin, and then betrayed him. The coffin was sold at auction without Reginald's knowledge or consent. He came to the Dorado rooms not as a seller, but as a man in a panic, trying to undo a chain of events that had spiraled far beyond his control. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a gravity I had rarely heard from him. Sarangi used them all. He cultivated Vane's obsession, knowing that Vane's research would identify the coffin's location and purpose. He identified Captain Pembroke, a desperate man with debts, military training, and access to his cousin's key, as the perfect instrument for the theft. He sent the anonymous letter on museum stationery to draw Hartwell to the auction, creating a spectacle that consumed everyone's attention while the true prize was extracted. Every player believed they were acting independently. None of them understood that they were pieces on a board being moved by a single hand. He reached for his coat. But the murder, Watson, the murder was not part of Sarangi's design. I saw his face at the auction. I read the careful precision of everything he has done. This is a man who orchestrates events with the patience of a watchmaker, not a man who resorts to violence. Craddock's death was Captain Pembroke's doing, the instinct of a soldier confronted with an unexpected obstacle, and it is the one element that has stained what Sarangi intended to be a surgical operation. He paused at the door. Tomorrow, Watson, we must find both men, the architect and the instrument, before the architect disappears and the instrument does something even more desperate. I shall be paying an unannounced visit to Hartwell and Crane, Lincoln's Inn. Mr. Hartwell purchased an empty shell last night for £4,200, and I suspect he is in a mood to answer questions he would not ordinarily entertain. A man who has been made a fool of is a man whose pride will override his caution, and pride, Watson, has undone more criminals than all the police forces in Europe. He reached for his hat from the peg. One more thing. When you visit the museum tomorrow morning, ask about Sarangi's background. I need his family, his history, his connections. The person I am looking for is not merely a scholar with convenient expertise. He is someone for whom the Sapphire Coffin is not a curiosity or a prize, but a birthright. The door closed behind him, and I sat alone in the fire-lit room, listening to his footsteps descend the 17 stairs and fade into the night. Chapter 9. The Trap. The reading room of the British Museum opened at Sinon, doors at 9 o'clock, and I was among the first to enter. Holmes's instructions had been precise, and I carried them out with the methodical diligence of a man who has learned through long experience that his companion's hunches possess the reliability of mathematical proofs. The staff records for Professor Vane's department were not, strictly speaking, available to the public. However, a combination of my card, a carefully worded explanation involving Scotland Yard, and the natural curiosity of a junior clerk who recognised my name from the published accounts of our cases, secured me access to a register of departmental appointments spanning the previous decade. I found what Holmes was looking for within 20 minutes. Dr. Anand Sarangi, Research Fellow, Department of Oriental Antiquities, appointed 3 years ago on Professor Vane's personal recommendation. Specialist area, mechanical and devotional artifacts of South Indian temple complexes. Born in Madras, educated at the University of Calcutta and subsequently at Cambridge, where, I noted with interest, he had read both engineering and history. A man, in other words, who possessed precisely the combination of technical expertise and historical knowledge that the disassembly of the Sapphire Coffin's mechanism would require. I copied the relevant details into my notebook, secured the register, and departed the museum with a quickening pulse. I was crossing Great Russell Street when a boy pressed a telegram into my hand from Holmes, sent barely an hour earlier. Hartwell confessed to purchasing Coffin Stop did not arrange theft. Stop received anonymous letter informing him of auction. Stop letter written on museum stationery. Stop come to Baker Street at once. Stop bring name Stop. I hailed a cab and was at Baker Street within the quarter hour. Holmes was standing at the window with his back to the room, but he turned as I entered, and I saw immediately that the hunt was reaching its climax. His face wore that mask of cold, absolute focus that I had witnessed before only in the final hours of our most dangerous cases. The name Watson. Dr. Anand Sarangi, Research Fellow under VIII, born in Madras, trained in engineering at Cambridge, 3 years in the department. Holmes received this with a single nod, as though I had confirmed something he had already deduced rather than discovered. Sarangi. Yes. I spent the early hours of this morning in the newspaper archives at Colindale, tracing the history of the village near the Dorai Temple. The massacre Professor Vane described, 43 civilians killed during a punitive raid in 1791, was recorded in a petition submitted to the Governor-General's office in Madras by the village headman. The petition was ignored, the witnesses were dispersed, and the village itself was eventually absorbed into a larger settlement. But the headman's family survived. His name was recorded in the petition. He paused. Sarangi. The word fell between us like the closing of a door. Dr. Anand Sarangi is not merely a scholar with convenient expertise, Watson. He is the direct descendant of the man who tried to bring Colonel Pembroke to justice 100 years ago, and was silenced. He came to England, secured a position under Professor Vane, whose research into the massacre had already identified the coffin as the repository of evidence, and spent 3 years preparing to recover what his ancestor was denied. Then he is the one who removed the mechanism from the coffin, and the one I saw watching us at every stage. He is the architect of the entire operation. Consider the elegance of it. Sarangi could not steal the coffin himself. He had no access to the crypt, no knowledge of its physical layout, no means of obtaining a key. But he did not need to. He needed only to set others in motion. But how did Captain Reginald come into it? Sarangi approached him through intermediaries, promising enough money to clear his debts in exchange for stealing the coffin from the family crypt. Reginald had access to Lord Pembroke's key during family visits to Thornfield. He had the opportunity to make a wax impression. He knew the crypt's layout from childhood, and he was desperate enough to accept without asking too many questions about who was buying or why. A knock at the door interrupted us, sharp, agitated, and repeated 3 times in rapid succession. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He crossed the room in 2 strides and opened the door. Captain Reginald Pembroke stood upon the landing. He looked dreadful. The military bearing that I had glimpsed briefly at the auction was gone. replaced by the haggard, hollow-eyed desperation of a man who has not slept in days and does not expect to sleep again. His coat was creased and stained, his collar dark with sweat despite the November cold. He carried with him the sour smell of cheap gin and cheaper lodgings, and his eyes, those were the eyes of a hunted animal. "It's over," he said hoarsely, before Holmes could speak. "I know it's over. I saw you at the auction, both of you. Green spectacles or no, Mr. Holmes, you're a difficult man to mistake at close quarters." Holmes stepped aside without a word. Reginald entered the sitting room with the stiff, mechanical gait of a man walking to the gallows, and when his gaze fell upon me, upon my open notebook, upon my pen poised above the page, he flinched as though I had levelled a weapon at him. "Sit down, Captain Pembroke," Holmes said quietly. Reginald sat. He placed his hands upon his knees, and I saw that they were shaking. Not the fine tremor of nervousness, but the deep, convulsive shudder of a man in the grip of something far beyond fear. "I killed him," he said. The words came out flat and toneless, stripped of everything but the bare, terrible fact. The caretaker, Craddock. I didn't mean to. I swear on my mother's grave I didn't. Go there to hurt anyone. He wasn't supposed to be there. They told me, the man who arranged it all, he told me the caretaker made his rounds at 10 and wouldn't return until dawn. But Craddock came back. Something had troubled him. A noise? A light? I don't know. He came down the steps with his lantern and he saw me standing there with the coffin in my hands, and he opened his mouth to shout. His voice broke. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and drew a ragged breath. It was instinct. 20 years in the army, and it was instinct. I caught him by the head and he could not finish the sentence. I laid him out properly. That's the only decent thing I did. I laid him on his back and closed his eyes, and then I walked out of that crypt, and I have not slept a single hour since. The room was very still. The fire whispered. The clock ticked. "Who arranged it, Captain?" Holmes asked. His voice was not gentle, but neither was it cruel. It was the voice of a surgeon who knows that the truth, like the knife, must be applied precisely. "I never met him face to face, not until last night. Everything came through letters, unsigned. They knew about my debts, amounts, names, dates. They knew about my visits to Thornfield, my access to Alistair's keys. They offered me £2,000 to steal the coffin and deliver it to a warehouse in Bermondsey. £2,000 and the debts would be cleared. I was drowning, Mr. Holmes. I was drowning, and they threw me a rope, and I didn't ask whose hand was on the other end." "But you went to the auction," Holmes said. "Why?" Reginald's jaw tightened. "Because the coffin was supposed to go to the warehouse, and that was meant to be the end of it. But I delivered it, and 3 days later I heard through the fences that it was being sold at the Dorado Rooms. Sold, Mr. Holmes, not to the buyer who had paid me, but at open auction to the highest bidder. I'd been cheated, used, and thrown aside. And I thought, God help me, I thought if I could buy it back, I could return it to the crypt and no one would ever know what I'd done." "You were prepared to spend money you did not have to undo a crime you could not undo," Holmes observed. "I was prepared to do anything," Reginald said, and the raw honesty in his voice was more terrible than any confession I'd ever heard in a courtroom or a police cell. "But it wouldn't have mattered, would it? Even if I'd bought the shell. What I really stole, what was inside, that's already gone." Holmes regarded him for a long moment. "Captain Pembroke, I will not insult you with false comfort. Thomas Craddock is dead, and the law will have its say. But you came here of your own volition, and that speaks to something in you that 20 years of soldiering and 6 months of debt did not entirely destroy. You will make a full written statement. Names, dates, the warehouse in Bermondsey, every detail of the arrangement. In return, I will ensure that the statement reaches the appropriate authorities through channels that will give due weight to your surrender." Reginald looked up. "And the man who arranged it? The one who used me?" "His name is Dr. Anand Sarangi, and I intend to find him tonight," Holmes said. "But you should know, Captain, that the justice he seeks is older and perhaps more legitimate than either of us would wish. The coffin contained evidence of a massacre ordered by your own ancestor, Colonel Horatio Pembroke, against 43 unarmed civilians. Sarangi's great-grandfather was among them. He has spent his life trying to recover the proof that your family spent a century trying to bury." Reginald stared at Holmes. The colour drained from his face in slow, awful stages, like tide retreating from a shore. "My God," he whispered. "Then it's true. The family curse. The thing Grandfather used to speak of in his cups. He said we carried a debt. He said the Pembrokes owed a debt that couldn't be paid." "It can be acknowledged," Holmes said. "That is not nothing." Reginald wrote his statement. It took the better part of an hour, and Holmes read it twice in silence before folding it into his breast pocket, beside the diagram of connections he had drawn the night before. As Reginald rose to leave, he paused at the door. He did not turn around. "Will you tell my cousin?" he asked. "Lord Pembroke will learn the truth," Holmes said. "All of it. He deserves no less." Reginald nodded once, and then he was gone, down the 17 stairs and into the November darkness, carrying with him the weight of a dead man's memory and a family's 100-year shame. Holmes stood at the window, watching the street below. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and edged with something I had rarely heard in it, not quite sorrow, but its near relation. "He will go to prison, Watson, and he will deserve it. But the tragedy is that he is not the villain of this story, merely its most visible casualty." He turned from the window. 7 o'clock, Watson. I have invited Professor VIII to Baker Street this evening. When he learns that his protégé is responsible for manipulating every person in this case, including VIII himself, I believe he will help us find Sarangi. Because VIII is beneath his obsessions a man of conscience, and the murder of Thomas Craddock is a stain that no amount of historical justice can wash clean. He opened the door and paused, and this time leave the revolver in the drawer. The weapon we need tonight is not made of steel. It is made of truth, and I intend to wield it with precision. Chapter 10. The Secret of the Sapphire Coffin. Professor VIII arrived at Baker Street at 7 o'clock precisely, and I could see from the rigid set of his jaw and the careful way he lowered himself into the basket chair that he had already begun to suspect why he had been summoned. Holmes offered him whiskey, which he refused, and tea, which he accepted but did not drink. The cup sat untouched upon the side table throughout what followed, its surface growing cold and still as the truth settled upon the room like the first frost of winter. Holmes did not waste time on courtesies. He stood before the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back and laid out the case with the same methodical precision I had heard him employ in courtrooms and drawing-rooms alike, each fact placed upon the next with the inevitability of bricks in a wall, until the structure stood complete and unassailable. He began with the crypt, the duplicate key, the measured shelf, the disassembled wall. He moved to the auction, Hartwell's purchase, the empty shell, the anonymous letter on museum stationery. He described Captain Reginald's confession, the debts, the unsigned letters, the warehouse in Bermondsey, the killing of Thomas Craddock. And then, with the quiet gravity of a judge passing sentence, he spoke the name that connected them all. Dr. Anand Sarangi. Vane closed his eyes. He did not protest. He did not demand evidence or cry out in disbelief. He sat very still in the basket chair, and when he opened his eyes again they were the eyes of a man who has been carrying a weight for a very long time, and has at last been forced to set it down. "How long have you known?" Holmes asked. "I did not know," Vane said quietly. "Not with certainty, but I've suspected since the night of the theft, when Anand failed to appear at the museum for 3 consecutive days and offered no explanation. He is not a man who misses work, Mr. Holmes. He is the most disciplined person I have ever encountered. And yet you said nothing. What would I have said? That a young man whose great-grandfather was murdered by British soldiers might have taken drastic action to recover the evidence of that murder. I had no proof, and He stopped, and I saw his hands tighten upon the arms of the chair. I wanted him to succeed. God help me, Mr. Holmes. I wanted those depositions found. I have spent 11 years proving that a massacre occurred and being told by every institution in this country that it does not matter. When Anand came to me 3 years ago with his family's story, with the petition his ancestor had written, with names and dates and the grief of 5 generations, I saw in him the chance to finally bring the truth to light. Even at the cost of a man's life? The question struck Vane like a physical blow. He flinched, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. I did not know about Craddock. I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I did not know anyone would be hurt. If I had known... If you had known, you might have acted differently. Or you might not. The past tense is a comfortable refuge, Professor, and I have no interest in exploring it. What I require from you is the present tense. Where is Dr. Sarangi? Vane was silent, for a long moment. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the seconds with mechanical indifference. He has a cousin in Southampton, Vane said at last, a merchant sailor. Anand spoke of him occasionally, said he was the only family he had in England. If he means to leave the country, that is where he will go. Holmes had his coat on before the sentence was complete. We caught the last train to Southampton by a margin of 4 minutes, Holmes having dispatched telegrams to both the local police and to Mycroft's contacts at the Harbour Authority during the cab ride to Waterloo. The journey passed in near total silence. Vane sat opposite us, staring at his own reflection in the darkened window, and I could not determine whether the expression on his face was grief, guilt, or the exhausted relief of a man whose long deception has finally ended. We arrived at Southampton docks shortly before midnight. The harbour was a forest of masts and funnels, the great ship, riding at anchor like sleeping giants, their running lights reflected in the black water. A police sergeant named Dunhill met us at the quayside with 2 constables, and the information that a man matching Sarangi's description had been seen boarding a merchant vessel, the Dorai Star, bound for Bombay, less than an hour earlier. The name of the ship stopped Holmes in his tracks. He turned to Vane. The Dorai Star, named for the temple. Vane nodded. His cousin's ship. I did not know the name until now. We boarded the vessel with the authority of Holmes's reputation and Dunhill's warrant. The Dorai Star was a modest cargo ship, perhaps 200 feet from bow to stern, and its crew regarded our arrival with the sullen wariness of men accustomed to inspections they had not invited. The captain, a weathered Tamil gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. Vikram Sarangi, made no attempt to deny his cousin's presence aboard. "He is in my cabin," the captain said simply. "He has been expecting you." We found Dr. Anand Sarangi seated at a small writing desk in the captain's quarters, a room scarcely larger than a closet, illuminated by a single oil lamp that threw wavering shadows across the walls. He was younger than his composure suggested, no more than 30, with a lean, intelligent face and dark eyes that held neither fear nor defiance but something closer to resignation. Before him on the desk lay a wooden box, plain and unvarnished, and beside it a sheaf of papers so old that their edges had the colour and texture of autumn leaves. He looked up as we entered, and his gaze passed over Holmes, over me, and settled upon Professor Vane with an expression of quiet sorrow. "I am sorry, Professor," he said. "I could not tell you everything. You would have tried to stop me." "You are right," Vane said hoarsely. "I would have. Holmes stepped forward. His eyes were fixed upon the papers on the desk, and I saw in his face the look of a man who stands at last before the object of a long pursuit. Not triumph, but a kind of solemn recognition. "The depositions," he said. "7 sworn statements," Sarangi replied, his voice measured and clear, the voice of a man who has rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times and will not waste it on trembling. "Written by British officers who witnessed the massacre at Dorey, and signed in the presence of a magistrate who was subsequently transferred to a posting where his silence could be assured. They confirm that Colonel Horatio Pembroke gave the order to fire upon unarmed civilians, that he personally directed the destruction of the village granary, and that he fabricated the military report that attributed the deaths to enemy action." He paused. "My great-grandfather's petition named every officer involved. He was ignored. These papers prove he was telling the truth. And you orchestrated the theft of the coffin, the manipulation of Captain Pembroke, the anonymous letter to Hartwell, and the extraction of these documents, all to bring them to India, beyond the reach of British law and British indifference." "Yes." Holmes's expression did not change, but his voice, when it came, carried an edge I had not heard in it before, the edge of a man who respects what he opposes. "A man is dead, Dr. Sarangi, Thomas Craddock, 37 years a caretaker. He had no part in your ancestors' suffering, no connection to the crimes of 1791. He was an innocent man who happened to be in the wrong place, and Captain Pembroke broke his neck because you put a desperate, violent man in a position where violence became inevitable." For the first time, Sarangi's composure fractured. It was not dramatic, a tightening of the jaw, a single slow blink, a barely perceptible shift in his breathing, but in a man of such extraordinary self-control, it was the equivalent of a scream. "I know," he said. "I have thought of nothing else since I learned of it. The plan was precise, Mr. Holmes. Every element calculated, every contingency addressed, except that one. I knew Captain Pembroke was desperate. I knew he was a soldier. I did not know—" He stopped, and his voice, when it resumed, was stripped of all its careful steadiness. "I did not know that a man drowning in debt would kill to keep his head above water. That was my failure. I used a weapon I did not understand, and an innocent man paid the price." "A fine speech," Holmes said, "and one which would carry more weight had you turned yourself in rather than booked passage to Bombay." Sarangi met his gaze without flinching. "These papers are more important than my conscience, Mr. Holmes, more important than yours. 43 people were murdered, and for 100 years the evidence has been sealed inside a jewelled box in an English crypt, and for 100 years no one has cared enough to open it. My great-grandfather tried. He wrote petitions, he begged the Governor-General. He was ignored, his son tried, his grandson tried, and each time, each generation, the answer was the same. It does not matter. It happened long ago. Let it rest." His dark eyes blazed. "I will not let it rest. I cannot let it rest. And I will not hand these papers to a British court that will seal them in another box for another 100 years, while it debates jurisdiction and procedure and the statute of limitations upon a crime that everyone has already decided to forget." The cabin fell silent. The ship creaked gently around us, and somewhere in the harbour a bell sounded, thin and distant across the water. Holmes stood for a long time, looking at the papers on the desk. I watched his face, and I saw something I had rarely seen there. A struggle. Not between deduction and error, which was the battlefield where he spent most of his life, but between two versions of justice that could not be reconciled, the law he served and the truth he revered. When he spoke, his voice was low and stripped of all its customary sharpness, carrying instead a weight that I had heard from him only in the rarest and most human of moments. "I cannot restore Thomas Craddock to life. I cannot undo the massacre at Dorai, and the law, Dr. Sarangi, is not a perfect instrument. It is a blunt one, forged by men no wiser than ourselves, and it breaks as often as it mends. He paused, and the silence around those words was absolute. Captain Reginald Pembroke will answer for Craddock's death. He has already confessed. You will provide a written statement describing your role in the arrangement, the letters, the intermediaries, the warehouse, so that the full picture is known. Professor VIII will corroborate what he knows. That much is not negotiable. And the depositions? Sarangi asked. His hand moved almost involuntarily to cover the papers on the desk. Holmes turned to Professor VIII. The old scholar stood with his back against the cabin wall, his spectacles reflecting the lamplight like two small moons, and the tears upon his cheeks were those of a man who has lived long enough to understand that some victories arrive wearing the clothes of defeat. Professor, you have spent 11 years seeking proof of a crime that the British Empire buried. If these documents reach India, they will vindicate your research and honour the memory of 43 people who were murdered without cause. If they remain in England, they will gather dust in an evidence locker until the last person who cares about them is dead. VIII said nothing. He did not need to. His answer was written in every line of his face. Holmes turned back to Sarangi, and then he did something that I had never seen him do in all our years together, something that I did not understand until much later, in the quiet of my own study, when I had time to reflect upon what it means for a man who has built his life upon the certainty of logic to acknowledge that logic alone is not enough. He reached across the desk and pushed the papers towards Sarangi. "Take them." Sarangi stared at him. For a long moment, neither man moved. "You are letting me—" "I am making a choice," Holmes said, and his voice was as hard and precise as a diamond-cutting glass. "A choice that the law would not make, that Inspector Rawlings would not make, that any magistrate in England would condemn me for. I am choosing to place the testimony of 43 dead civilians above the procedural convenience of an empire that murdered them, and spent a century pretending it had not." He held Sarangi's gaze with an intensity that seemed to fill the small cabin from wall to wall. "But understand this, Dr. Sarangi. I'm not forgiving you. Craddock's blood is on your hands as surely as it is on Reginald Pembroke's, and no amount of ancestral justice will wash it clean. You will carry that man's death for the rest of your life. That is not a punishment I impose. It is a fact I observe." Sarangi wrote his statement. His hand was steady, his account precise. VIII witnessed it. Holmes read it once, folded it into his breast pocket, and turned toward the cabin door. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are finished here." As we stepped onto the deck, the cold sea air struck my face like an open hand. I looked back once and saw, through the cabin's small porthole, the golden flicker of the oil lamp and the dark silhouette of a young man holding a sheaf of papers that had waited 100 years to complete their journey. We walked in silence along the quayside, the great ships looming above us in the darkness, and it was only when we had reached the station and stood alone upon the empty platform that Holmes spoke again. "Some truths, Watson, were buried with the dead for a reason, yet others refuse to remain in their graves. The Sapphire Coffin has given up its secret, and I find that the secret, like most secrets, is simply this: that powerful men do terrible things and then spend a great deal of effort ensuring that no one remembers." He lit his pipe, and the match flared briefly against the dark. "Craddock will have his justice. The dead of Dorai will have their truth, and Lord Pembroke will carry his ancestors' shame as his forebears carried it before him, not as a punishment, but as a reminder that the past is never truly past." I thought of Captain Reginald sitting alone in some wretched lodging-house, waiting for the dawn and the constables who would come with it. I thought of Professor VIII, who had given 11 years of his life to a truth that had finally been spoken aloud. I thought of Sarangi, sailing into the darkness with his great-grandfather's vindication pressed against his chest. And I thought of Thomas Craddock, who had tended a churchyard for 37 years and died because he took his duties seriously on the wrong night. The train arrived, its headlamp cutting through the fog like a single bright eye. We boarded in silence, and as the Hampshire countryside gave way to the dark suburbs of London, I looked across at Holmes and saw that he had closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in that state of deep, contemplative stillness that came upon him when a case had touched something beyond the reach of deduction. I took out my notebook and, by the dim light of the carriage lamp, began to write.